Hi everyone. I'm doing this on live and people can rewatch later because I just really did not feel like editing. And I have ADHD, so when I want to talk about something, when I have an idea in my head, I need to share it like right away. And such is the case with this. So this is kind of going to be an all-encompassing discussion because it kind of all runs into the topics all kind of follow each other. Um, for anyone who hasn't seen my recent video, just as like a quick update with the FEI blood rule revision, anyone who hasn't heard about this, basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to revise a rule regarding blood in the mouth or the nose of the horse. And the original rule was such that any presence of blood in the mouth or the nose was cause for elimination. Um, the revision that they're trying to pass in November is trying to take that away so that there is no elimination if blood or in the mouth or the nose is found, and that instead riders get a warning. And it would take 2 warnings in a 12-month period for them to actually see any type of repercussion. And the repercussion they would receive if that happens would be a 1 month suspension and a fine. And something to note is that if you look at like the average income of the people who are competing at the FEI level and just the level of access and level of privilege that they have, a fine really isn't a punishment. Like a really good saying to live by is that fines are only punishment for poor people. If you have lots of money, a fine is basically just the price you pay to break the law. So anything where the primary punishment is a fine is inherently problematic. Like we saw some high profile riders get fined for ethical problems and like horse abuse. Andreas Helgestrand is one of them. Charlotte Dujardin also got fined. But if you consider what they're actually having to pay in relation to like how much they make, it's not very much. So a fine is really only an incentive to change if you are not rich. So that's something that's important. Is my audio even on? Can people hear me? I think my ears were muted. But so the FEI blood rule revision essentially serves to enable people staying in competition when they have generally, like, if the horse could have bit the tongue, the horse could have like with nosebleeds, it can be like a fluke thing. It's not always going to be due to someone riding heavily abusively, yanking on the mouth, etc. Accidents can happen. However, I firmly am in the camp that even if it's an accident, you should be eliminated, because as soon as you leave it up to opinion and you make it a little bit vague, that means that someone can come in and try to justify the fact that their horse is bleeding from the mouth and their nose. So I think the eliminations should stick regardless. And it's just kind of like a tough shit type deal where if you have a horse that has blood in their mouth or nose during competition, you get eliminated and it's a fluke accident. Sucks to be you in that case, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So anyways, that's the blood rule revision. Now, the bigger, broader topic that I wanted to talk about is what I've learned in my work as an equine behavior consultant and like approaching this ethical debate and advocacy and policy change in the horse world. Because I find that a lot of the nuance of what that work actually looks like behind the scenes gets lost online. I started YouTube and like just being online when I was like 16 or so. Like, so I've been online for quite some time now, but I started out very young, and the approach that I've had towards these kind of things has changed, as have my opinions, because when I was very young, I had perspectives that were really influenced by my earlier teachers and were not necessarily grounded in welfare. Now that I've gone to school and I've got my certification for equine behavior consulting and done all that jazz, I've had to get a lot of hands-on experience that involves trying to change people's minds. And something that's really important to note in the advocacy sphere, especially when you're going and you're talking to people in person and you're talking in front of crowds. I'm going to reference a specific scenario in this case with the 2023 Equine Welfare Conference that I went to speak at in France. I spoke on hyperflexion and roll cur was kind of the primary topic of that conference. So I went there as a speaker, and we had FEI representatives that were there to listen, and also a lot of other professionals in the horse world, including saddle fitters, bit fitters, body workers, veterinarians, and all sorts of different types of people speaking. And then there is the FEI representatives and FEI judges. And going there, the goal was to try to create policy change, to try to increase awareness about hyperflexion, and to try to hold the FEI accountable for their lack of policing of people who ride in hyperflexion. And in being there, like, I have a lot of my personal perspectives on the FEI and how I feel they're an unethical organization. They're a multi-billion-dollar organization, and I think that they pander and cater towards their rich athlete participants. Most riders that are identify as equestrians, and even if they compete a little, most don't make it to the FEI level. It's a level, the FEI and above is a level of high privilege, where you typically see people who are coming from quite affluent backgrounds. But I have my perspectives on the FEI. I went into that conference with my belief systems being such that, if I was being blunt and I was talking to friends, I could say I think that this is an organization that cares more about money than horse welfare. I think that they are trying to gaslight people into normalizing abuse practices, and I could have all these types of opinions that I could say bluntly in that type of circumstance, but it's not going to garner me credibility in the same way that creating an actual argument and discussion would. So in that kind of conversational sphere, my goal is to, one, appear credible, to two, have a good argument, to three, have conversation, and to four, to be able to back my points and hold people accountable, face to face with FEI representatives. It's not to say my piece, to have the loudest voice in the room, to win the battle in the sense that I feel the need to say things when it might not be the time to say them. It's about biting your tongue when necessary and then knowing when to push when necessary. So I did my speech. I listened to the FEI officials, their director of solidarity, Jean Philippe. Camboulive, I think is his last name. It's French. I don't know how to pronounce it. And his speech was basically him talking about like, he brought up the FEI horse welfare code of conduct within the context of, like, these are the ethical obligations that we uphold. These are our belief systems. The FEI is very committed to horse welfare, blah, 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 blah. And then he proceeded to go on and contradict himself a bunch of times. So during his speech, I was in the back and I had my computer open because I was taking notes. I actually edited my speech because I was to follow his speech, I think, either immediately after or maybe with one speaker between us. And I wrote down a bunch of the things that he was saying that I could easily show contradiction of, where the FEI wasn't actually following through by following their horse welfare code of conduct. So I was writing these things down, keeping an eye on them, and preparing to call him out on what he was trying to claim the FEI was doing. And this is an example where I did bring up gaslighting. I added a slide about gaslighting to my slideshow, and then I quoted him about what he said about the FEI code of conduct for horse welfare. I quoted that code of conduct for horse welfare, and then I proceeded to show the rest of my slideshow, which showed a bunch of examples of where they broke their own code of conduct. It pissed him off so much that he actually walked out during my speech. But this whole thing was getting live streamed, and it made him look like a not very credible person. So then we fast forward to a Q&A section, and someone specifically asked me a question during the Q&A. They asked me what my opinion on bitless riding was and why I felt the FEI wasn't legalizing it across disciplines. And I said that I felt that it was fear-based, that people were fear-mongering and trying to say that it was a safety issue, and that it's also widely rooted in tradition, and that there's no real evidence of there being a greater chance of safety when you're riding bitted. I'm pretty sure he either ended up interrupting me right then during my answer, or he did it afterwards. Either way, he interrupted me multiple times, and basically went off on a tangent about how it was all safety related, and that we can't have horses just running amok and being super dangerous and running through the hands of their riders, and that it would put everyone at risk, and that if we made bitless riding legal, people could show up to these competitions ill prepared and then have a dangerous, out of control horse. We each had a time frame in which we were able to speak. It was like a minute and 30 seconds or something. He went well over his time frame. The host of this summit was cutting him off multiple times and saying like, that's enough, that's enough, that's enough. And then it was my turn to respond. He interrupted me like 3 times. And I was like, I'm not finished talking. I'm talking. It's my turn to talk. It's my turn to talk. You're interrupting me. And then finally, he was silenced by the people hosting this type of discussion. And then I was able to have my response where I was like, okay, let's look at what you said here. You're claiming that bitless riding not being legal is a safety issue. But the disciplines that bitless riding is legal in are one, show jumping, which you allow people to run at meter 60 fences bitless if they so choose. And if there's a safety risk, that's one where the consequence is a lot greater if bits are truly what are keeping riders safer. And then two, another discipline where you allow bitless riding, a great example would be endurance riding. And endurance riding, people are riding 100-mile rides over open terrain by themselves. And yes, there's a lot of vet exams and they have stuff to try to keep the horses safe. But if bits were truly what was keeping horses safer, that would be another example of a discipline where it would make the most sense to have bitless illegal if it was actually a safety decision. And then I said to him, I was like, also, if we have riders who are professional riders that have ridden and competed enough to get to the FEI level and they cannot be trusted to make safe equipment choices, so does that not say something about the quality of riders that are making it to this level if they cannot be trusted to make safe equipment choices? And then the last thing I said is that there's literally no evidence that bitless riding is more unsafe. But even if there were, my argument would be, why is it more unsafe for a dressage rider to ride bitless than it is an endurance rider or a show number? And anyways, he didn't really have a rebuttal to that because he had nothing to back his claims because there is no science that backs them. And it put him in a position where he ended up looking not very smart and saying things that he couldn't back. And that's like a great example of when you're engaging in advocacy to be careful that you don't say things or speak them as if they are facts if you cannot back and support those points, because he could not do that and it undermined his credibility. And this particular instance, the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because I was actually surprised about how ill prepared these representatives were when they were essentially going into a Shark Tank. They knew they were going to a welfare summit. They knew that there was a lot of stuff that people didn't agree with them on. They knew what they were walking into, or they should have known. And they still didn't prepare, and they still weren't media trained enough to really make sure that they were saying things that made the FEI look good and to be able to back the claims that they made and be prepared. They kind of floundered it because there was a judge that was also there that made a comment in support of hyperflexion and like on the live stream. And it was just a really bad look. So basically what I learned from that is that that was 2 years ago now. So I was 27. I was a lot younger than a lot of the people there, especially the FEI officials. And I was like, wow, like I came in here more prepared than they were. And they work for a multi-billion-dollar corporation and they should all be media trained. And that was pretty eye-opening for me. So that experience combined with my work as an equine behavior consultant has taught me a lot, because as a behavior consultant, I'll have people calling me in that have issues with their horses. Their horses might be in a state of poor welfare. They might be having extreme stress issues. They might be having a lot of things going on. And there might be a lot of stuff that I don't agree with in their care. But my goal is to try to better the life of the horse, not to tell their owner how wrong they are. I need to have them feel comfortable to the point where they'll listen to my suggestions and be able to apply them. So the goal in those cases is identifying certain problems, ideally starting with the ones that are the most likely contributors, and then providing actionable steps. A lot of behavioral problems we see in horses are caused by their management. However, if you break down what is the easiest for someone to do immediately, especially when they're getting to know you and learn how to trust you, if it's something like, hey, your boarding facility sucks, your horse shouldn't live here, their needs aren't being met. At minimum, even if they right there were like, "You're right, I'm gonna move," they have to give 30 days notice at the vast majority of barns. That's not an immediate solution. It's not even a necessarily quick solution. And also, a lot of people have made friends with the barns that they're at. They have relationships with the barn owners and the riders there, and they're going to feel attacked if you start criticizing all of these aspects of the barn, and they might not be comfortable leaving right away. So you have to look at the human element of it too. Even if at face value you could go, this horse is not getting turned out enough, this horse is not getting socialization, this horse isn't getting enough access to forage, and all of these factors are causing this horse to behave in a highly stressed manner. All of those things can be true, but you're also working with a human who has likely been conditioned to think that certain things are okay and not know they're a problem. So if I were to come in there with new clients and fly off the handle and go, these are all the things you're doing wrong, your horse is really miserable, and if you don't change these things right away, you're abusing your horse, I would get fired so quick. I would not get asked to come back because they would feel very defensive, they would feel attacked, and I haven't built rapport and trust with them yet. I have to give them actionable steps. So what that might look like is to talk about, okay, like how often is your horse turned out? Do they have access to social turnout? What does their hay look like? If they're not getting free choice access to hay, I'll go, hey, like you could go and you could get a slow feed hay net. And if they're stabled a lot, you could actually get a few slow feed hay nets and you can hang them all around the stall so they can move from net to net. And that'll encourage them to walk a little bit more, even though being stabled a lot is not ideal. If they're not getting enough turnout, I can bring up the fact that that is a likely contributor to a lot of their behavioral problems. And while I understand you might not be able to immediately change that, here are some things that you can do in the immediate moment, or over the next few days slash weeks to start to make a difference in their lives. Because ultimately, any small steps in the right direction are better than no steps at all. And when we come at people in a really aggressive manner where we're shaming them, we're calling them stupid, um, we're making it feel like they have to make one specific decision and have no other avenues to go. It can feel so trapping that you then lose any progress that you would otherwise have because the person's just going to go, no, I don't trust you. I'm going to defer back to all of these other people in my community that I've known for longer than you that will reaffirm the perspectives that I have currently that I'm more comfortable with. And that's what we see a lot of when people don't want to change. The amount of clients that I have where even if I approach them gently and I offer these solutions and I give them smaller actionable steps that don't necessarily want to commit to the full change right away is actually pretty high. So I'll have clients that I'll make suggestions to. If they don't listen to the protocols that I'm offering and I don't feel like I'm going to make progress because they're not following the plans that I'm making for them, then I will fire them as clients in a nice way and just basically be like, I can't help you if you're not going to take these steps. And let them go off on their own. And usually they sit with that, they try other things, it doesn't work, and then they end up calling me back out. And then we work on a solution then, and they're in a position where they're more likely to listen then. And that's the nature of like working with hands-on experience. So you might be asking, Shelby, why are you saying all these things? The point that I'm trying to make is that advocacy isn't going to be in your face all the time. It isn't going to be where you're constantly seeing immediate progress or where there's big wins all the time, because a lot of it is setting that foundation. A lot of it is taking small, persistent steps to build credibility, to start to shift perspectives, and then waiting. The amount of people over the years who followed me and repeatedly left nasty ass comments and just disagreed with me and told me I'm an idiot that have later sent me messages and be like, you've changed my mind, thank you, a lot higher than you think. And I always admire those people because it is really hard to admit that you were wrong. It is really hard to approach someone that you've knowingly spoken ill of and shit talked and be like, hey, you were right. That's hard to do. But the most important thing to consider in particular is like the horse world is very tradition based. There's a lot of echo chambers within barns and within communities, and where someone grows up, who they learn to ride from, and the types of people they build community with in the horse world are going to impact their behavior and their belief systems a lot. So in order to see change in the horse world, we need to start to shift those belief systems. And this doesn't mean that people shouldn't be held accountable. It doesn't mean that we should just tell people what they want to hear all the time, but it means choose your battles. choose when something it needs to be done right now and see what's the best way to go about it that's actually likely to result in change for the horses. Um, Otherwise, we won't really get ahead. With some of the stuff that I do, especially with like really hardcore abuse cases, and honestly, a lot of the stuff with like upper level riders and their abuse scandals, I share and I talk about it not because I expect to change that rider's opinion, but because I want other people to see what I'm seeing and see the issue with it and to start to shift their perspective of what they view as good horsemanship. So that's another factor of that too, is if your goal is to not change that particular person's mind, then the goal needs to be education, and there needs to be explaining why something's not ideal, why it's impactful to horse welfare, why the horse is behaving the way that they are, and what the potential solutions are. And also emphasizing the fact that if you lower horse stress, that you're going to have a much safer, more regulated horse, and you'll start to see very positive differences overall. Um, and just helping people learn how to spot things. And then if your goal is to change a particular person's mind, then you need to look at it through the lens of how should I approach this that will make this person the most receptive to hearing what I want to say. And in a lot of cases, that does not involve saying anything publicly. It involves contacting them privately and talking to them behind the scenes, and not making like a big show about it. So, for example, if I see someone at a horse show abusing a horse or being told to abuse a horse by their trainer, I'm not going to yell at them in front of a crowd of people unless it's something that needs immediate intervention. Especially if it's a kid, I might pull them aside or pull their parent aside and just make mention of what the issues are, because they're more likely to be receptive and they're less likely to be hyper defensive. So I try to tactically plan how I do stuff like that. And also anything involving children as a whole, including online, like I very much avoid talking about children, because they are the byproduct of who taught them how to ride. They are not complicit. Like they don't call the shots. Speaking as someone who grew up as a child learning how to ride and handle horses in an abusive way, I was following instructions. I thought adults knew everything that was correct, and I thought that they were guiding me and advising me to do things correctly, and I would never have stood up against an adult. I do know that some children are capable of doing that, but I don't think that we should use them as a standard for what is normal or reasonable for kids to do. So I try to avoid talking about kids ever online and critiquing anything with kids at all, unless there's like a legitimate safety issue to the child, in which case it's not calling the kid a horse abuser or critiquing what they're doing, it's critiquing the situation that they were placed in by an adult. A great example of this would be I've seen lots of videos on TikTok in particular where adults are putting their toddlers, like I'm talking like 4 years of age and under, and they might be on little ponies, but they're on these little ponies that are like bucking and being dangerous, and they're not wearing helmets. And I don't care what people think. I don't think the parents will be like, oh, it's a choice, they chose to. It's like, no, kids cannot consent. They do not know what risk they are signing up for. And as a parent, that's just completely out of line and not okay. You should be putting a helmet on your small child, especially when they're on a horse that's behaving dangerously. But like no matter what, like even the barrel racing clips of children like galloping Mach 10 towards a barrel without a helmet, it's pretty common to see very young children doing that without any helmet on. And it's like, I don't care if you think a cowboy hat looks cooler, because you want to know it's not cool, brain damage. So that's a time that'll bring up children. And then there was a time, like recently on my Facebook page, I did share a video of a child to compliment her because she was at the Horse of the Year competition in the UK and her pony tripped. And it was a pretty minor trip. Like I've seen full blown Grand Prix level riders have horses almost go down on their nose and continue on. Or recently a 5-star event rider, the horse literally went down to the knees and like slammed their face on the ground and ate grass, and they just kicked the horse on and kept going and finished a 5-star event course. This was a child that had a horse that had a stumble, and she pulled the horse up immediately and got off and eliminated herself. And that deserves compliment because that is a child that has more tact and consideration for her horse than a lot of adults at the top levels have shown. And I think that that's a great example that she set. But all of that aside, like, I really try to avoid talking about kids. Like, I know back in the day, like, probably minimum 5 years ago now, I think it was probably more like 7 or 8. Like, I did do a video on day by day, and criticize the parent more so than anything, because like the horse was lame and like the parent and the trainer should know better. But I've stepped away from doing stuff like that, because while the horsemanship in those cases isn't good, there are people who are serving a far greater audience and maintaining the image of being a professional and being goals that are influencing way more people in a way more dire way, that I can criticize a lot more easily and openly than I can anything involving children um, or anything like that. Like, I have my own views about like family vloggers too, and the way that some of them conduct themselves and build content, and I just don't think it's always super fair to the kids. And it also sets the kids up to be judged online by lots of different people, especially if the child is like the focal point of the account. Um, I'm not someone that's like completely against posting children online at all and like sharing memories and whatnot. But when the whole account and like the focal point of the account and why people are following you and giving you attention is for your children, that just feels pretty weird to me. But yeah, that said, like, I think that having I want to, the difficult thing for me is like when I'm planning stuff and working behind the scenes for like policy change and a lot of the shifting, like the initial planning and foundation building isn't getting shared online. So people don't actually get to see the work involved, because a lot of times we can't share it right away when we're just getting information. Like, I hear a lot of things about high profile people in the equestrian world, and I can probably only share like 10% of them, because I need to have clear evidence, and it needs to be something that I'm absolutely like beyond a shadow of a doubt that I can prove, because otherwise I can get attacked for, like, I can get a legal battle for libel or slander. And even if I do know it beyond a shadow of a doubt, if there's a campaign plan to try to use it to push for systemic change and policy change, we need to be careful how we go about using that. Plus, like, I also have to pick my battles of like when it's worth it, which is the same reason why if I get people sending me the same person over and over again, I'm not always going to do video on it, because it really depends. I also look at a lot of things like, and this might just be the autism in me, but through a way of like scaffolding the level of harm they're causing. So for me, with like the stalling issues with horses, like horses who are stabled for like 18 plus hours a day, that is one of the most dramatic welfare issues that impacts their behavior in such a big way. And then it ends up being a catalyst to why people use harsher and harsher equipment and do stuff like using lip chains, nose chains, harsh bits, tons of training gadgets. A lot of that stems from having a chronically stressed horse, and a lot of that chronic stress stems from management. And that is something that, like, it is the foundation of a lot of the biggest ethical dilemmas that we see in the horse world, because a lot of the harsh equipment we see people using wouldn't be necessary if their horses had their needs met and were not chronically stressed. So that's like a big one for me, which people who follow me for a while know that I relentlessly talk about, because it's something that I also have personal experience with. When I was showing Arabians and I had my Arabian show horse, he was stabled a lot for many of the years that I had him. And when I eventually moved him into herd turnout and I started having him live a life where his needs were more met, the change in his behavior was like dramatic, and it was basically overnight. And it was such an eye-opening situation for me that I could never look away, because none of the training had even changed. And that's the thing too, is management contributes so much to behavior that if you address the management issues first, the behavior for everything else can shift, and it can take away the need that people feel to train in a really harsh way. So that's one of the biggest issues that I target in the world, in the ethics world for horses, and then also the stuff at upper level competition, because competition isn't necessary. Like, any ethical concessions that people are making just to compete a horse, it is very hard to justify, because the horses do not benefit from competing. There's no ethical benefit to competing. So that's one too, where it's like if we're gonna compete them and we're gonna have this privilege of having horses in competition, there's certain standards that need to be fulfilled, and like people aren't just entitled to competing just because they feel like it. So these are like the different factors that I consider as well. Because I would say competition horses often have less of their needs met, especially the higher of a level that you climb to in competition, because people will justify stabling them more out of risk, out of worry of risk of injury and other things. And if anything, like a horse's price tag and like how high of a level they compete to, those should have no bearing on whether or not they get their species appropriate needs met. But we see that justified a lot. And then I think the other thing that we need to look at, like as a community, is that there's often a lot of infighting where people are badgering with each other and nitpicking, like very, in the grand scheme of things, little things, and attacking like amateurs and junior riders and people who are not operating as a professional or a role model more than they critique people who are operating as a role model and actually actively teaching people and are a professional in the community. Like I see it a lot with like just equitation critique is a great one. Like if you're an amateur or a lower level rider, people will nitpick every little thing about your riding. But then when a Grand Prix rider rides around with like the sloppiest leg and equitation problems and they're stabbing their horse's spurs every stride, people will go, oh, well, like, let's see you compete at that level first. And it's just like the trump card to try to get people to never have accountability once they hit a certain level of riding. Like there's this idea that once you make it to a certain level that you're untouchable criticism wise. Meanwhile, people are criticizing people who are like admittedly learning and are not operating as a professional to an extent that they do not critique the professionals too. And these upper level professionals get let off the hook for a lot of issues then, which is not okay. They should be held to the highest standard because usually the people that we're looking at that are amateurs, junior riders, or even lower level professionals, a lot of them base their views off the things that they see at the top, or the people who are training them base their views off the things that they see at the top. So it comes from the top down, and if the people at the top are being held to a lower standard than literally everyone else, we can't really expect to improve things. So that's also something to look at too, is like regarding picking your battles, as I said earlier, is to really consider like who has the greatest duty of portraying themselves in an ethical manner. And I would argue it's the people who are getting in the media the most and competing at the Olympics and who are setting the standard of this is who you should aspire to be, because there's this whole notion that people at the top have the best horsemanship despite the lack of evidence that that's the case. So anyways, those are my thoughts on like advocacy and ethics and like having a nuanced opinion, because the other thing too is I found that there's this perspective that people who have done bad things must remain bad all the time. And if that's the case, there's no point in advocacy. Like if I didn't have belief that people could make change and become better equestrians and better their horsemanship, there'd literally be no point in me doing anything that I'm doing. Like my job would be useless. This whole platform would be useless. There would be no point. My thing is that the more that someone publicly displays the fact that they do not care about the horse's welfare, the more evidence there needs to be to show that that's actually shifting. So that's the thing. Like someone like Clinton Anderson, for example, I need to see a lot of evidence of changed behavior to fully believe that he's actually made the difference and isn't just like posturing for social media. But at the same time, if he's showing evidence of that change and I'm not seeing anything else, it's not really like I don't have the right to continue criticizing the past stuff if it's not continuously recurring. But I would be a lot more suspicious of someone like him. Same with someone like Andreas Helgestrand. I would hope that they'd make changes to their ethics, and I would hope that we'd see differences. But ultimately, they've made so many public appearances that show that they do not care about horse welfare to such a deep level that my standards for believing that there's actually changed behavior and it's not just them doing damage control would be a lot higher. But I'd be a huge hypocrite if I didn't leave the door open for people to change, because I recognize the fact that I've changed. And a lot of my perspectives and practices and beliefs when it comes to horses have changed over the years. And I've really developed as an equestrian, and I now have completely different views than I even would have had like 5 years ago. So a lot of change can happen within a relatively short period of time, and we need to leave the door open for that. Otherwise, it begs the question, what is the point in advocacy? Because if we do not believe people can change, we're literally just talking at the camera for no fucking reason. And that's pointless. It's just like talking to hear yourself talk then, if it's not to change perspectives and change minds. But I wanted to share that thing about the FEI thing, because I think that that's important, and it also sheds light on like the type of people who are making these rule revisions. So anyone who missed the beginning of this, when I end this, I suggest going back to look at it and listen to what I said, because it just really shows why these type of revisions are happening and who is pulling the strings in the FEI. And like obviously that's just one person, but it does shed light on the fact that like these people are not as educated and all knowing as what you might like to believe, despite the fact that they are operating at a very high level of like decision making competitively. My cats. Oh my god. Queso. But yeah, anyways, that's my thoughts, and I'm gonna share more at a later date, but I just wanted to